What's going on out there, everybody? I hope everybody's staying empowered and staying motivated. Welcome to a special edition of Solomon Soul. I'm your host, Solomon Hillfleet. To those who may know me in a more personal space, though, my name is Samuel Wright. I'm an educator by trade. Writing is a way that I educate and express myself, and hip-hop is the tool that I use to go about educating. So you want to know just a little bit about me. I'm an educator by trade. I love writing. I love using hip-hop as a teaching tool to do that. So that's just a little bit of information about me. I'm going to talk a little bit about myself before I get into why we're doing this podcast and what makes it special. So let me tell you a little bit about myself first, and then we'll go into the why, the how, and the what. So for those who may or may not know, in the digital space, I started writing about 6 years ago. Started working with publications like Hip Hop DX, did a couple review pieces for them. I currently still work with Hip Hop Wired, and I write everything from editorials to interviews. I've also written on for other digital publications like Magnetic Magazine, where I've written different interviewed some of the blog era artists like Mickey Fax and Blue. I've got to interview on my own publication, Solomon Soul, which is a SubStack. I've got to interview a couple other artists, some out the city, Michael Montana, a lot of the big oomp artists. I've just had my fair share of interviews with established and indie artists, and that's how a lot of people have known me for the last 6 years. But my journey into writing actually started about a decade ago when I started writing about things that were personal to me, and I feel like it's a great time for me to go back into that space. So with that being said, the reason why we're doing this podcast today, I'm going to talk about a topic that's very dear to me. For those who may or may not know, I'm going to be releasing a book in June during Men's Mental Health Month, and it's going to be called For Black Men Who Need Therapy and Never Got It. That topic is very personal to me for a number of reasons. For those who may or may not know, I lost both of my biological parents over the course of the last 2 years. I lost my mom December 25th, 2023, and lost my dad last year in July. I think it was July 18th, 2024. And that really got me on the path of looking for answers and things in my life to try to make sense of what's going on. And that led me to a personal discovery journey that got me to this point now where I'm sharing things with you all that I've learned along the way. So a lot of yapping, but I think I got some of those points in. Let's talk a little bit about why this book is coming out, though. Here's a short version of it, guys. When I started out, after I lost my mom in 2023, I started looking for things that would kind of help me make sense to some of the things that I saw. And one of the texts that I stumbled across was this book called Force versus Power by David Hawkins, I believe is his name. And it really helped me to understand my emotions, the way the world worked. And from there, I just went down like the rabbit hole, reading different other texts. Some are spiritual and going down that vein. And what I realized was not only was this information helpful to me, but I feel like it would be helpful to you guys. So I said, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to write down notes of these things, and we're going to compile all that into a text. So that was my thought process. And the result of that is what you guys are going to be able to read very soon, For Black Men Who Need Therapy and Never Got It. I actually started therapy for the first time in 2017 and 2018. And my objective was I've been going through a lot of rocky relationship and situationships with different women in my life, and I realized I was looking for value in other people other than myself. So I went and talked to a therapist. I do think it was helpful to a degree, but I realized it didn't really give me the answers I was looking for. And I think part of it was because I knew what the answers to those questions were, and I just needed to kind of go within for it. So that's what I did. And so I do what I did best, was looking for the answers in myself. I started reading different other things that would corroborate with it. And along that journey, that brought me to not only the answers, but just this realization. And I think for us as black men, I think this is where a lot of us are, is that there's a lot of things in this world that are set out here to stop us from being our best selves. And if we don't really seriously wrestle with it, we can't be good for anybody, much less for other people. And I think that's where I got on my journey with this situation. So, but with that being said, that's a little bit about why I'm doing this. This whole thing is about giving black people, and in particular black men, tools to be able to deal with the stress of everyday life. And I think the thing that I want us to realize is this central thing right here. in everything in society, we constantly hear about how black men are the causes of all the violence, of all the calamities that we deal with, because, men are the aggressors in a lot of these situations. But very rarely do we have real conversations about how we help them deal with the conditions, how we help reinforce their self-esteem. So I said, let's start with us. So it's titled For Black Men Who Need Therapy, but it's for black people in general who need it. So to know why I'm doing it, I dealt with my own struggles, and I wanted to give everybody else a blueprint to it, with the hope that it would give them tools to get through it. So that's why. Let's talk a little bit about what we're going to be talking about, and maybe a little bit of how we're going to get into it. So to get into what we're going to be talking about, for this book, I really spent a lot of time looking at a mix of psychological aspects and theories from just like established people, but also with an Afrocentric lens, because I think the thing we have to realize as black people, the stress that we've endured, the trauma that we really have in our system, it has to be approached with a different lens. Like, one of the concepts I'm going to be exploring briefly in the book is about how trauma, they did research that shows traumas can be passed down up to 14 generations. And as we're looking at science more, we're starting to find out that a lot of men are the carriers of trauma. Like, our seeds carry the epigenetic trauma that's going to then affect us. And because we know that, we have to be aware. We got to be aware of what we're passing on to the next generation in a literal sense and in a figurative sense. And so that's going to be some of the things that I'm going to be talking about, why our particular situation is different. But I also think, and I think you all have noticed it as we've been looking at the art that's been coming out, from Ryan Coogler's movie Sinners to everything Kendrick Lamar is saying, like, when you look at what's really going on with us as black people, and you really think about our unique situation, we're going to have a different approach. And that approach is going to have to embrace ancestral information, ancestral knowledge. And I know that that's a heavy topic. And I know for some of y'all are like, man, not this again. But the reality is we can't get away from it. We have to get back to our ancestral information. We have to get back to embracing the parts of our culture that are helpful for us, with the understanding that people like Dr. Amos Wilson, who's like a famous black psychologist, told us if it's things in our tradition that don't apply to now, we got to discard it. But if there are things that were helpful, we need to retain it. And there were some things that our ancestors did that were helpful that we need to keep. And that's my objective with for Black Men Who Need Therapy, is getting us to tap back into who we are as a culture. Because most of our issues come from a lack of cultural knowledge, I argue. I'll make a personal example. For example, when I went to, when my dad passed, it really was a defining moment for me, because my mom's passing, it brought me a sense of relief, because she, our family, we struggled with seeing my mom deal with multiple sclerosis for the better half of our life. My mom was diagnosed with multiple sclerosis in like 94, 95. I remember her walking with a cane. My younger brother doesn't remember it probably at all. But over the course of 30 years, we dealt with that. And I can recall, being at school and having to leave school sometimes to come help my mom, or, make sure she fell, picking up off the ground, like things like that. Like, I can recall it. Whether we knew it or not, that was trauma that we kind of witnessed. And it kind of gave us a certain emotional resolve that made us a little bit more stoic and more serious than our peers. So I've always kind of had more of a serious demeanor because of that, right? But what I realized is, when she passed, I was kind of relieved in the sense that she wasn't in pain, and the answers I was looking for were a little bit different. With my dad's passing, I had to reckon with the fact that I was now responsible for not just myself, but for future generations, because he was like the griot. He was like the person with all the wise information and ancestral knowledge, and now that had to be me. You know what I'm saying? And because that had to be me, the thing I kept saying to myself was, you know what? Now I have to ask myself, do I have enough to be able to give other people? And there was a moment when I was at the funeral, and we were, speaking on our dad, and, it all hit me at once. And I'll never forget, I said the saying that when an ancestor passed, they says a library burned down. And I was just like, who's going to be the one now to bestow that information? And I'll never forget two of the ministers there, when they were doing their speech, one of them said, I could feel the ancestors in here. And then as we were going out, and they played Going Up Yonder, because they played that at my mom and my dad's thing. You know, that's a black thing. That's a cultural thing, to play Going Up Yonder. When they played Going Up Yonder, she came by and she whispered in my ear and she said that knowledge and information is safe with you. She said he gave it to you, it's safe with you, and you're going to take it and carry it. And that was like confirmation that it was on me to take it and carry it. So that's, that brings us to, what we're going to be talking about. So it's going to be basic psychological concepts on things that we're going through in the community. Things like men struggling with their sense of identity and self-worth and looking for it in women, and now embracing like more cynical views like what we look at as with Red Pill. It's going to be focusing on us adopting a more warrior mindset as opposed to a more thug mindset, right? Taking that energy and shifting it. It's going to be about us learning to be more integrated, embracing our creative side, embracing the more feminine side of us, with the understanding that feminine and masculine, when we're talking about in these cases, are just titles that we're putting out relating to aspects. We're even going to tap into the Kemetic or Egyptian concepts that talk about, personalities in nature and how animals represented personalities that we sought to have. One of the concepts that I talk about and I've talked about in videos is the fact that the Western world uses Machiavellian principles. And Dr. Amos Wilson said, look, we can look at any information, but we got to look at it from an African-centered lens. And our ancestors, they believed in the symbolism of falcons, the symbolism of the dung beetle, like things like that. They understood their significance. And what I'm saying is we have to learn to do the same. So there's nothing wrong with having a lion mindset, thinking like a fox, and with everything now, with everybody talking about the 100 men versus the gorillas, it's just made me think like, now we got to move into that space of thinking more like gorillas. Because if you really look at the characteristics of gorillas are vegetarian. If you look in the mindset of gorillas are the leaders of their pack, like the silverback, but they're naturally peaceful creatures. They don't go out seeking violence, but they are protectors, and they will take it to that extent to protect anything they love. And that's a paradigm shift that I hope for us, Now, with all this said, how am I going to do it? I'm going to talk a little bit about how the book is arranged in a minute, but I want you guys just to take a moment if you've been following me and listening to what I'm saying, and I really want you to just ask yourself, man or woman, what was your first experience with therapy? How was the experience? Did you feel like it gave you what you needed? And I think that's a good talking point, because we have a lot of therapy talk in our culture now. We have a lot of academic words put in our culture, and we're starting to weaponize therapy. We're starting to make people feel bad if they don't find someone that they feel comfortable with in therapy, with the understanding that for a lot of men, we don't often see representations of ourselves in these types of spaces. We don't. And then the other quiet part that's not being said out loud is, and black women have told us this and they're not wrong, is we're responsible for fixing the masculinity issues in our community, and it's not their job to help us sort through those. They can assist us, but we got to do the work in doing that. Part of doing that work is we need to have these conversations. We need to have these professionals. And for the people who are maybe not in that space yet, we need to have tools or conversational points that we can use to discuss that. You know what I mean? So with that being said, how we're going to do it is this book is going to be a condensed version of some of the information I've learned. I'm going to do a 3-part volume, and this is volume 1. And volume 1 is just going to be an introduction. It's going to be a very quick read, but I tried to condense it and make the information, digestible. So it should be digestible, but, the thing you got to consider and ask yourself is just, look, when we're looking at what's going on in our community, have any of us ever really went through therapy? Have we had successful experiences with therapy? Have we had successful experiences with medical professionals who deal with psychology, psychiatry? Have those been positive experiences? And if they haven't, what things do we have to eradicate that? You know what I'm saying? So those are a couple things that we're going to be talking about, man. I look forward to getting you guys' perspective. And, one of the things that I'm going to say before we wrap up this episode, I'm just going to put this out here to you. I just want you to take a couple questions with yourself as we go into next week's episode. I want you to think about your experiences with therapy. I want you to think about the experiences of men in your life and whether or not they've ever had successful experiences for therapy. Have you ever considered the conditions that men have endured in their situations and whether or not they were favorable to them? And then I want you to ask yourself, is black men's mental health something that we think is important? Right. With that being said, much love to everybody. I hope everybody continues to stay empowered and stay motivated. Until next week, peace.